On a tiny speck of coral located more than 600 kilometers off the Australian coastline, a tragic phenomenon was claiming the most massive gathering of marine turtles on the globe. The culprits were not oceanic predators or illegal hunters, but the landmass itself. During every nesting season, thousands of massive females, roughly the bulk of large oak barrels, dragged themselves onto the shore, only to never return to the waves. For 30 years, researchers monitored and tallied the fallen. Eventually, a dedicated crew proposed a concept that seemed utterly ridiculous. They resolved to construct a barrier. Here's the story of how it unfolded. The location is known as Rain Island. On navigational charts, it appears as a mere speck, a low-lying coral cay spanning about 800 meters on the extreme northern fringe of the Great Barrier Reef. Situated approximately 620 kilometers northwest of Cairns, it is so profoundly isolated that the general public is strictly prohibited from stepping ashore. This sanctuary is a heavily guarded national park, frequented almost exclusively by scientific experts and the indigenous custodians who have understood its rhythms for millennia. To the Wuthathi people of Cape York, it is honored as Thukuru. To the Meriam people of the eastern Torres Strait, including the communities of Ugar, Mare, and Arub, it forms a vital piece of a vibrant maritime landscape they have preserved through 60,000 years of unbroken wisdom. And once every year, this miniature outpost transforms into the most bustling marine turtle maternity ward on Earth. The green sea turtle is an ancient voyager. Its evolutionary predecessors were navigating these exact currents when prehistoric giants roamed the continents, and its physical form has barely altered since those ancient eras. A fully matured female spans roughly 1.2 meters across her carapace and tips the scales at about 180 kilograms. She dedicates nearly her entire existence to the open ocean, foraging on sprawling seagrass beds hundreds of kilometers away. Yet, when the moment arrives to deposit her eggs, she executes a feat of navigation that continually astounds marine biologists. She charts a course across the vast, trackless ocean to the precise stretch of shoreline where she emerged from her own shell decades prior. Some of the matriarchs arriving at Rain Island today clawed their way out of this very same sand more than 30 years ago. The sheer magnitude of this migration is difficult to fathom until witnessed from the sky. In December of 2019, surveyors piloted a drone high above the swells surrounding Rain Island, capturing footage of an event previously undocumented in its full glory. The azure water was peppered with dark silhouettes, thousands upon thousands of them, endlessly patrolling the perimeter, awaiting their chance to climb the beach. After the specialists marked the shells of roughly 2,000 individuals with a harmless indicator and calculated the proportions from the aerial view, the final tally was breathtaking. 64,000 green sea turtles were congregating around a solitary cay, roughly the scale of a few city parks. That aerial assessment accomplished much more than yielding stunning visuals. It exposed a critical flaw in all prior estimations. By relying on visual tallies from small watercraft, previous observers had been underestimating the true gathering by a factor of nearly 1.73. The actual community was vastly more extensive than anyone had dared to imagine. For Andrew Dunstan, the principal investigator steering the initiative, this revelation was simultaneously a beacon of optimism and a blaring alarm. It was an optimistic sign because the surviving numbers were far stronger than feared. However, it was profoundly urgent, because almost the entirety of the northern Great Barrier Reef green turtle population, roughly 90% of them, leaned entirely on this single, delicate haven. Should Rain Island collapse, that whole ecological community would plunge with it. And by the time those aerial cameras took flight, the island had already been steadily failing its inhabitants for an extensive period. Biologists have been intensely analyzing the local wildlife here since 1974. For the initial 2 decades, the focus was predominantly observational, involving tagging the mothers, logging the nests, and tracking the seasonal pulses. Then, in the mid-1990s, the statistics took a confusing and dark turn. Catherine Robertson, a senior coordinator on the initiative, characterized the shift as deeply troubling. Tens of thousands of expectant mothers were still making landfall annually, but alarmingly few hatchlings were breaking through the surface. When the team started excavating the unsuccessful clutches to uncover the mystery, the truth was heartbreaking. The unhatched eggs were suffocating beneath the tides. Over the span of 4 breeding cycles, the proportion of clutches that successfully matured on Rain Island plummeted to a dismal range of just 12 to 36%. On any robust nesting shoreline elsewhere on the globe, that success metric typically hovers above 80%. Rain Island, the most critical sanctuary of its kind globally, had secretly transitioned into one of the most barren. The root of the issue was the terrain itself. Over decades, the low-lying sandy expanses had gradually subsided relative to the surrounding sea level. During peak tides, saline water was creeping upward through the porous sand, entirely inundating the hidden clutches. A reptile egg is fundamentally permeable. The developing life inside requires a steady supply of oxygen, and when submerged for an extended duration, the growing embryos perish before they can fully form. Controlled experiments on Rain Island clutches illuminated the strict margins of this tragedy. A brief dampening caused minimal damage, but approximately 6 hours of submersion slashed the survival probability by about 30%. Furthermore, the earliest phases of incubation proved to be the most vulnerable. Every swelling tide was silently erasing the upcoming generation. Yet, the loss of the clutches was merely half of the unfolding catastrophe. The second half was afflicting the mature females. Visualize a green turtle weighing 180 kilograms, anatomically perfected for soaring through deep oceanic currents, yet hopelessly clumsy on solid earth. She hauls herself onto the beach under the cover of night to deposit her legacy. Amidst the chaotic crush of tens of thousands of her peers, she pushes further inland in search of untouched sand, eventually encountering the low, rugged escarpments near the island center. These are not towering precipices. They are modest ledges formed from ancient phosphate deposits, standing merely 1 or 2 meters high. But for a creature contoured like a heavy armored vehicle, that slight elevation is catastrophic. She attempts to ascend, loses her footing, tumbles backward over the brink, and impacts the ground entirely inverted. A marine turtle flipped onto its carapace is physically incapable of righting itself on dry terrain. Her flippers simply sweep the empty air. As the tropical dawn breaks and the atmospheric temperatures skyrocket, she rapidly overheats. There was even a specific location on the key that the field workers grimly dubbed the Perilous Outcrop, a singular rocky formation where hundreds of these ancient wanderers became hopelessly wedged beneath a rocky overhang, stripped of any route of escape. Others found themselves firmly jammed within the coastal crevices, unable to break free. Many simply exhausted their energy reserves on the exposed dunes, succumbing to the severe heat before they could scramble back to the refreshing ocean. During the most brutal seasons, as many as 2,000 fully grown females were perishing on Rain Island every single year. Analytical reviews indicated that these tumbles and entrapments alone accounted for roughly 1/3 of all adult turtle losses on the landmass. Consider the weight of that statistic. These were not fragile hatchlings. These were robust, proven matriarchs, the absolute rarest and most irreplaceable members of a heavily threatened lineage. These were the champions who had successfully navigated 30 years of oceanic hazards just to reach this destination. And they were meeting their end mere paces from their exact birthplace, claimed by the very architecture of the island. Consequently, in 2014, a coalition of dedicated individuals resolved to execute an intervention that practically no one had ever dared to attempt. They committed to re-engineering a natural island. This massive endeavor became officially recognized as the Rain Island Recovery Project. It was not the solitary pursuit of a single organization, but rather a profound alliance. The Queensland governing body, the Australian federal authorities, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, the resource enterprise BHP, and the Great Barrier Reef Foundation merged their efforts closely with the Wuthathi and Miriam Nation traditional custodians. In unison, they pledged nearly $8 million over a span of 5 years. Their strategy was rooted in what environmental scientists term adaptive management. This involves testing a remedy on a miniature scale, meticulously tracking the outcomes, and expanding the infrastructure only if the data validates it. Many of the interventions they were preparing to deploy, particularly in an environment this isolated and delicate, had never been implemented anywhere else on the planet. And the very first concept they trialed was undoubtedly the most unconventional. To halt the tragic tumbles, they proposed erecting a barrier between the nesting grounds and the rocky drops. It sounds almost impossibly basic, a simple fence designed to preserve an ancient imperiled marine reptile. Yet the underlying rationale was flawless. The animals were not tumbling because the cliffs were an impassable maze. They were plummeting simply because there was no tactile warning between their heavy bodies and the sudden void in the darkness. A physical barricade strategically positioned could gently deflect an off-course matriarch away from the hazard, guiding her back towards secure, flat sand. The initial experiment, conducted back in 2011, was incredibly modest. The crew erected a mere 100 meters of modified aluminum barrier, closely resembling the type of enclosure typically found around countryside gardens. It stood a mere 50 centimeters tall, featuring vertical rods spaced about 30 centimeters apart, secured along the upper rims of the minor escarpments on the eastern flank of the landmass. Crucially, they kept the natural sandy inclines unobstructed, ensuring the wildlife could still access the central zones where optimal nesting occurred. Following the installation, they performed the most essential task in any scientific endeavor. They monitored the results. Prior to the barrier's arrival, an inspection of the cliff base revealed 60 fallen individuals. After the barrier was secured, that identical inspection yielded only 2. From 60 down to 2. This unorthodox theory was a staggering success. That solitary data point catalyzed everything that came next. Over the subsequent several years, the coalition expanded the barricade around the perimeter, swapping the humble garden prototype for a bespoke, highly durable installation specifically engineered for this unique purpose. In one subsequent intensive phase alone, they integrated an additional 300 meters of fencing, elevating the total guarded distance to 1,450 meters. By the time the construction phases concluded, the habitat was embraced by approximately 1,750 meters of protective infrastructure. And this is the most vital aspect of the narrative. The traditional custodians did not merely observe from the sidelines. Rangers from the Wuthathai and Miriam nations personally directed the deployment of the barriers across their own ancestral sea territory, utilizing a profound intimacy with the landscape that no visiting academic could ever replicate. However, a barrier could only prevent the falls. It offered absolutely no defense against the rising tides. Therefore, the Alliance confronted the second, exponentially more complex dilemma. They set out to physically elevate the shoreline. This monumental logistical feat involved relocating roughly 40,000 cubic meters of sand, a volume substantial enough to entirely fill 16 grand municipal reservoirs, utilizing heavy earth-moving equipment transported to one of the most secluded marine outposts in existence. They meticulously contoured approximately 35,000 square meters of nesting terrain, boosting its elevation well above the maximum reach of the surging waters. The transformation was instantaneous and easily quantifiable. Across the newly elevated sectors, the crucial clutches were now securely deposited high above the inundation zone. The mothers dispersed more evenly instead of congregating densely within the same doomed, low-lying strips, which directly resulted in far fewer instances of previously buried clutches being accidentally unearthed by newcomers. Most importantly, the reinforced dunes maintained their structural integrity. 5 years post-construction, structural assessments verified that the re-engineered zones remained firmly stable, actively functional, and perfectly dry. Despite all this heavy engineering, the collaborative team never abandoned the most fundamental task of all. Every single dawn, a dedicated patrol embarked on what they respectfully termed the morning recovery walk. They traversed the shorelines at the very first light, and one after another they manually righted any inverted females, carefully extracted any individuals wedged tightly within the coral crevices, and physically guided the utterly exhausted giants, carrying all 180 kilograms of their weight back into the cooling surf before the severe daytime heat could claim them. It was deeply exhausting, completely unglamorous, and incredibly demanding physical labor. According to one comprehensive tally, that solitary daily patrol personally preserved the lives of 696 mature mothers. To definitively confirm if the grander scheme was genuinely reversing the decline, the specialists had to conquer one final hurdle. They needed an absolute, undeniable headcount of the population, which circles back to that crucial aerial drone. For decades, the census had been conducted entirely manually. Field workers would apply a harmless, bright white pigment to the carapaces of roughly 2,000 individuals during the night shift. The following morning, operating from a small vessel, they would tally the ratio of marked versus unmarked animals swimming offshore, utilizing that proportion to extrapolate the total presence. However, this method harbored a critical vulnerability. The human visual cortex naturally locks onto the high-contrast white markings. The tagged individuals were disproportionately noticed, while the unpainted ones blended into the dark waves, ultimately skewing the final calculations significantly downward. When Andrew Dunstan's unit meticulously reviewed the aerial drone recordings frame by consecutive frame within the laboratory, that visual bias completely vanished. Viewed from the heavens, every single creature was merely an equal silhouette against the ocean backdrop, regardless of any markings. The final output, subsequently featured in a respected peer-reviewed journal, was the highly accurate, corrected census of 64,000. This brought the astonishing realization that decades of manual observation had undervalued this magnificent gathering by nearly 3/4. With precise data in hand, tentative hope transformed into undeniable proof. The project yielded massive structural triumphs that reshaped the future of the species. Point 1. Start with the rocky edges. Over the duration of this extensive initiative, the proportion of fatalities directly linked to tumbling over the ledges plummeted dramatically, from 30% down to a mere 5%. That shift represents the profound difference between sacrificing roughly 1 in 3 of the island's precious inhabitants to an easily avoidable tragedy versus losing merely 1 in 20. Based on the most conservative and rigorous analytical models, the strategic fencing network alone was actively preserving more than 500 mature mothers during every single reproductive season. 500 vital matriarchs every year who would have otherwise succumbed while helplessly inverted under the scorching sun, were now successfully retreating to the deep ocean, guaranteed to return and nest in the future. Point 2. Then there is the matter of the clutches. With the shoreline significantly boosted above the menacing tidal reach, the tragic inundation that had devastated Rain Island for 30 years was finally thrown into reverse. The newly contoured sandy expanses effectively doubled the total volume of viable, safe nesting real estate across the entire landmass. Every clutch deposited onto this newly raised, perfectly dry terrain was finally granted a legitimate opportunity to complete its incubation cycle uninterrupted. The elevated beaches securely held their shape, directly shielding the vulnerable developing embryos from the suffocating saltwater that had previously erased entire generations overnight. Point 3. The ultimate success of the entire endeavor is captured perfectly by one staggering metric. As a direct, measurable consequence of the Rain Island Recovery Initiative, more than 640,000 additional green turtle hatchlings have already successfully navigated off those sands and vanished into the protective ocean currents. 640,000 tiny new lives that under the previous crumbling conditions would simply have never drawn their first breath. Furthermore, that extraordinary figure is entirely dynamic and continuously expanding. Because of the extended biological life cycle of these marine wanderers, the mathematical benefits will exponentially compound over the coming decades. There was also a beautifully unexpected bonus hidden within this massive effort. The identical barricade that protected the heavy reptiles from the dangerous ledges simultaneously prevented them from accidentally wandering into the deep interior of the cay, a zone where massive flocks of seabirds established their own delicate nurseries. For years, disoriented turtles had been inadvertently flattening the fragile avian nests and displacing the vulnerable chicks. Once the barriers were firmly installed, the seabirds instantly reclaimed their safe nesting territories. A single, focused conservation project had quietly initiated the healing process for much more than just one target species. Every so often, the environment delivers a profound, quiet testament to exactly how enduring this ancient cycle truly is. During one recent expedition, the scientific crew identified a mature female by examining her faded identification tag. They quickly deduced that she had initially been cataloged an astonishing 30 years prior at a wildly distant oceanic foraging ground, completely undocumented ever since. After 3 decades of navigating the vast, unpredictable open ocean, she had flawlessly navigated her way back to this exact same patch of sand to fulfill the identical duty her lineage has performed since the era of the prehistoric giants. Ultimately, this is the profound lesson that Rain Island provides, and it is a truth worth remembering. These magnificent creatures were not fading away because the planet had completely run out of space to accommodate them, nor because some insurmountable cosmic force had arbitrarily decreed that their epoch was finished. They were failing to survive due to a distinctly solvable mechanical issue. A sandy shoreline that had simply eroded a fraction too deeply, and a rocky overhang that was slightly too abrupt to navigate in pitch blackness. And crucially, the individuals who deeply respected this sanctuary absolutely refused to simply turn their backs and dismiss the tragedy as nature merely running its cruel course. They meticulously investigated the structural flaw until they comprehended its mechanics flawlessly. They courageously trialed an incredibly modest concept, akin to a countryside garden barrier, at the most micro level imaginable. They logged the outcomes with absolute empirical honesty. And when 60 lost individuals remarkably dwindled to merely 2, they possessed the vital foresight to aggressively expand upon that success, seamlessly fusing cutting-edge environmental engineering with 60,000 years of profound ecological stewardship provided by the very people who have forever protected this territory. It is incredibly tempting to assume that rescuing a heavily threatened species universally demands some unimaginably complex, financially impossible miracle. Rain Island proudly dictates the exact opposite. On certain occasions, salvation simply requires immense patience, transparent data collection, the absolute correct coalition of dedicated minds, and a well-placed barrier exactly where it is needed most. Somewhere far off the Australian coastline this very evening, the heavy tide is rolling in, yet it is no longer dragging the fragile next generation down into the suffocating depths. On a stretch of sand that was terrifyingly close to becoming completely barren, 640,000 tiny new voyagers have already scrambled down to the waterline and melted into the dark surf, performing exactly the journey they were forever destined to make. If sophisticated stories of ecological resilience resonate with you, consider subscribing to the channel to join us as we continue to explore the rare corners of the globe where the natural world is quietly reclaiming its victories.